Tonight, we journey through the remarkable life of a man who changed how we understand the very nature of reality. This is the world that Erwin Schrödinger revealed to us, not through mystical revelation, but through the patient unfolding of mathematical poetry. His story begins in the elegant streets of Vienna, where gaslight flickered against cobblestones, and where the intellectual ferment of the Habsburg Empire was giving birth to new ways of thinking about the universe itself. Before we start, consider subscribing to the channel. Chapter 1. The Viennese Beginning. On a warm August day in 1887, as the sun cast long shadows across the imperial city of Vienna, a child was born who would one day unlock secrets of the quantum world. Erwin Rudolf Joseph Alexander Schrödinger entered the world on August 12th, the only son of Rudolf Schrödinger and Georgian Emilia Brenda Bauer. His father, a man of remarkable intellectual breadth, owned a small linoleum factory inherited from his own father, yet his true passions lay in the realms of botany and art. Rudolf was not merely a businessman but a Renaissance soul, spending years studying Italian painting before turning his attention to botany, where he published scholarly papers on plant phylogeny. The Schrödinger household was one where curiosity was currency and learning was life's greatest pleasure. Erwin's mother, Emily Bauer, brought her own rich heritage to their home. Half English and half Austrian, with family roots stretching from Leamington Spa to Vienna itself, she ensured that young Erwin grew up speaking both German and English with equal fluency. This bilingual upbringing would prove invaluable throughout his career, allowing him to communicate effortlessly with scholars across Europe and beyond. In this nurturing environment, young Erwin's mind began to unfold like a delicate flower reaching toward light. His father served not merely as parent, but as friend and teacher, never tiring of answering the endless questions that bubbled forth from his son's bright and inquisitive mind. There was something almost magical about their relationship, a meeting of intellects across generations that would shape Erwin's approach to learning for the rest of his life. The decision was made early that traditional elementary schooling would not suffice for this exceptional child. Instead, Erwin received his early education at home from private tutors, immersed in an atmosphere where learning was not a chore but a joyous exploration. Picture the young boy in the family's comfortable Vienna home, surrounded by his father's botanical specimens and art books, absorbing knowledge like a sponge drinks water. It was not until he reached the age of 11 that Erwin ventured beyond the familiar walls of home learning. In 1898, he entered the prestigious Akademisches Gymnasium, one of Vienna's most distinguished institutions. This classical grammar school emphasized the ancient foundations of learning, Greek and Latin, logic and literature. Far from finding these subjects dry or irrelevant, young Schrödinger embraced them with enthusiasm. His later recollections paint a vivid picture of his time there. He loved mathematics and physics, certainly, but he also found deep satisfaction in the strict logic of ancient grammars and the beauty of German poetry. What he despised, with the fierce intensity that only a gifted child can muster, was the mindless memorization of dates and facts, the pedantic dissection of literary works that killed their living beauty. A fellow student would later remember Schrödinger with something approaching awe, describing how he possessed an almost supernatural gift for understanding. In physics and mathematics especially, he could grasp concepts immediately and directly during class hours, applying them with what seemed like playful ease. After lectures, their professor would call Schrödinger to the blackboard to solve problems that would stump other students, and he would work through them with a facility that appeared almost magical to his classmates. This was not mere academic brilliance, though brilliance it certainly was. There was something deeper at work, a quality of mind that could penetrate to the heart of complex ideas with remarkable clarity. Even as a young student, Schrödinger displayed the intellectual courage that would later allow him to revolutionize our understanding of the quantum world. The Vienna of Schrödinger's youth was a city in intellectual ferment. The Habsburg Empire was entering its twilight years, but this approaching dusk seemed only to intensify the brilliance of its cultural and scientific achievements. The university system was among Europe's finest. The artistic life was rich and varied, and in the coffee houses, philosophers and scientists, writers and musicians would gather to debate the great questions of existence. This was the atmosphere that shaped young Schrödinger's sensibilities. He was not merely studying subjects, he was absorbing an entire way of approaching the world, one that valued depth over superficiality, synthesis over narrow specialization, beauty alongside truth. The famous Burgtheater, Vienna's premier dramatic venue, became a second home to him. There, amid the velvet seats and golden decorations, he would lose himself in the works of great dramatists, developing an appreciation for the dramatic structures and emotional depths that would later inform his own approach to presenting scientific ideas. As he moved through his gymnasium years, it became increasingly clear that this was no ordinary student. His mind ranged freely across disciplines, finding connections and patterns that others missed. He was already beginning to display that characteristic that would mark his entire career, the ability to see the underlying unity beneath apparent diversity, to find the simple principles that could illuminate complex phenomena. Chapter 2: The University Years and Formation of a Physicist. When Erwin Schrödinger walked through the doors of the University of Vienna in 1906, he was entering not just an institution of higher learning, but one of the great centers of European intellectual life. The university had a tradition stretching back over 6 centuries, and its physics department was particularly distinguished. Here, in lecture halls that had echoed with the voices of generations of scholars, Schrödinger would encounter the ideas and personalities that would shape his scientific destiny. The most profound influence on his development came from Fritz Haesnerhall, a brilliant theoretical physicist who had recently succeeded to the chair once held by the legendary Ludwig Boltzmann. Haesnerhall was a man of exceptional gifts, someone who might have achieved greatness in physics had fate not intervened. He considered it both his privilege and his duty to continue the work of Boltzmann, carrying forward the Austrian tradition of deep physical insight combined with mathematical rigor. Under Hasenerhol's guidance, Schrödinger dove deep into the foundations of theoretical physics. He studied analytical mechanics, learning how the elegant mathematical formalism could capture the essence of physical motion. He mastered the application of partial differential equations to dynamics, gaining skills that would prove crucial in his later work. Perhaps most importantly, he acquired a thorough grounding in eigenvalue problems in the physics of continuous media, mathematical techniques that would form the foundation for his greatest discovery. The relationship between Hasenerhol and Schrödinger was more than that of teacher and student. It was a meeting of kindred minds, both possessed of that rare combination of mathematical sophistication and physical intuition that marks the truly great theoretical physicists. Hasenerhol exercised what contemporaries described as a profound and lasting influence on young Schrödinger. The older man's approach to physics, his way of thinking about problems, his emphasis on understanding rather than mere calculation, all of these became part of Schrödinger's own intellectual DNA. Years later, when Schrödinger received the Nobel Prize, he would say with deep emotion that had Hasenerhol not been killed so young, it would be his beloved teacher standing there in his place. This was not false modesty, but genuine recognition of a debt that could never be repaid. The tragedy that would claim Hasenerhol's life in 1916, serving at the Italian front during the Great War, would deprive physics of one of its most promising practitioners. But Schrödinger's education extended far beyond the physics lectures. The University of Vienna maintained the continental tradition of Bildung, the cultivation of the whole person rather than narrow technical training. In mathematics, he studied calculus and algebra under Franz Mertens, function theory and differential equations with Wilhelm Wirtinger. Though he found Wirtinger uninspiring as a lecturer, the mathematical foundations he acquired would prove invaluable throughout his career. He also delved into projective geometry, algebraic curves, and continuous groups, subjects that might seem abstract and removed from physical reality, but which would later inform his understanding of the mathematical structures underlying quantum mechanics. This broad mathematical education was characteristic of the Vienna school, which emphasized that a physicist must be first and foremost a mathematician of the highest caliber. The experimental side of his education was equally thorough. Working alongside KWF Kohlrausch, he conducted practical work for students, though he would later admit with characteristic humor that he never quite learned what true experimenting was. This experience of working with real apparatus, of seeing how abstract theories connected with concrete measurements, gave him a grounding in physical reality that would serve him well when he later developed his revolutionary theoretical insights. In 1910, after 4 intensive years of study, Schrödinger received his doctorate in theoretical physics from the University of Vienna. His dissertation, titled On the Conduction of Electricity on the Surface of Insulators in Moist Air, might seem like a narrow technical topic, but it represented a solid piece of original research that demonstrated his mastery of both theoretical analysis and physical understanding. Even before completing his degree, Schrödinger had begun to publish research papers, a remarkable achievement for someone still formally a student. These early works covered a diverse range of topics including statistical problems, dielectrics, and magnetism. Later, he would also work on X-ray diffraction in lattices, following up on Max von Law's groundbreaking discovery in 1912. This early research already showed the breadth of interests and the willingness to tackle challenging problems that would characterize his entire career. After graduation, Schrödinger remained at the University of Vienna, taking a position as assistant to Franz Exner at the Second Physics Institute. This was a natural progression, allowing him to continue his research while gaining experience in the practical aspects of academic life. He was deepening his understanding of theoretical physics, while also learning the arts of teaching and scientific communication. The Vienna of these years was reaching its cultural zenith. In the coffee houses, one might encounter psychoanalysts like Freud, composers like Schoenberg, writers like Musil, all engaged in revolutionizing their respective fields. This atmosphere of intellectual ferment and creative breakthrough was intoxicating for a young mind like Schrödinger's. He was absorbing not just scientific knowledge, but a way of thinking about the world that valued innovation, that sought to penetrate beneath surfaces to discover the hidden structures of reality. It was during these formative years that Schrödinger also began to develop his lifelong interest in philosophy. He was particularly drawn to the works of Arthur Schopenhauer, especially The World as Will and Representation. This philosophical interest was not merely an academic exercise, but a deep engagement with fundamental questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and knowledge. These philosophical investigations would later profoundly influence his interpretation of quantum mechanics and his understanding of the relationship between mind and matter. Chapter 3: The Great War and Personal Awakening. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 sent shockwaves through the Austrian Empire, and like countless young men of his generation, Erwin Schrödinger found his academic career abruptly interrupted by the call to military service. At the age of 27, this brilliant theoretical physicist traded his laboratory bench for an artillery officer's uniform and found himself serving on the Austro-Italian front. The Great War was a catastrophe that consumed an entire generation of European intellectuals, and Schrödinger was fortunate to survive when so many did not. His beloved teacher Hasenerhol would not be so lucky, falling in battle in 1916. But even amid the chaos and brutality of warfare, Schrödinger's scientific mind remained active. Remarkably, he managed to continue his research work even while serving as an artillery officer, publishing his first paper on quantum theory in 1917. This ability to maintain intellectual focus under extreme circumstances speaks to something essential in Schrödinger's character. Science for him was not merely a profession, but a calling, a way of engaging with the deepest mysteries of existence. Even when surrounded by the mechanical horror of industrial warfare, he could still find moments to think about the fundamental structures of physical reality. The war years were also a time of personal growth and change. The young man who had entered military service was in many ways still a product of his sheltered Viennese upbringing. The person who emerged had been tested by hardship and had proven resilient. He had seen the fragility of the civilization he had taken for granted, and this experience would give him a deeper appreciation for the precious nature of intellectual freedom and scientific inquiry. In 1920, as Europe slowly began to heal from its self-inflicted wounds, Schrödinger took a step that would prove personally transformative. On March 24th, he married Annemarie Bertel, a young woman he had met through family friends. Annemarie, known to her friends as Annie, was the daughter of an actor and court photographer. Their meeting had been arranged through KWF Kohlrausch, Schrödinger's former laboratory partner, who knew the Bertel family. The relationship between Erwin and Annemarie developed slowly, partly due to his extended military service. But by 1920, it had progressed to the point where marriage seemed the natural next step. The wedding was a modest affair, reflecting both the reduced circumstances of post-war Austria and the couple's practical nature. At this time, Schrödinger was earning very little as a young private lecturer, and ironically, the couple's economic survival depended largely on Annemarie's income from her work as a secretary for an insurance company. This marriage would prove to be one of the most enduring and complex relationships in the history of science. Despite what contemporaries described as Schrödinger's unusually open marriage, Annemarie remained devoted to him throughout his life. She would follow him through his varied professional paths, share his emigrations and exiles, and provide the stable foundation that allowed his genius to flourish. Their relationship defied conventional expectations and scandalized more traditional colleagues, but it worked for them in ways that might puzzle outside observers, but clearly provided both partners with what they needed. The early years of their marriage were marked by financial struggle and professional uncertainty. Post-war Austria was a shadow of its former imperial self, its economy shattered, its universities impoverished. For a young scientist trying to build a career, these were challenging times indeed. Schrödinger found himself jumping from one temporary position to another, never quite sure where his next opportunity might come from. In 1920, he became assistant to Max Wien at the University of Jena. From there, he moved to Stuttgart as an associate professor, then to the University of Breslau as a full professor. Each move represented a step up the academic ladder, but also meant uprooting his life and starting over in a new environment. For someone of Schrödinger's cosmopolitan background, this nomadic existence was perhaps easier to bear than it might have been for others. but it still represented a significant challenge. Throughout these years of professional wandering, Schrödinger continued his research with remarkable productivity. He was investigating problems in statistical mechanics, thermodynamics, and atomic physics. His papers dealt with specific heats of solids, problems of thermodynamics where he showed his deep engagement with Boltzmann's probability theory, and questions related to atomic spectra. He was also pursuing his interest in color theory, conducting physiological studies of color perception that grew out of his contacts with experimental physicists and his reading of Helmholtz's work. This period of his life, while professionally unsettled, was intellectually fertile. He was working across multiple areas of physics, developing the broad understanding and mathematical techniques that would soon prove crucial. Like a musician practicing scales and etudes, he was mastering the fundamental skills that would allow him to compose his masterpiece when the right moment arrived. The philosophical interests that had begun during his student years continued to deepen. He was reading widely in German philosophy, particularly drawn to thinkers who grappled with fundamental questions about the nature of reality and knowledge. This wasn't mere intellectual curiosity. It was a systematic exploration of questions that physics alone couldn't answer. What was the relationship between the mathematical formalism of physics and the reality it purported to describe? How should we understand the role of consciousness in physical measurement? These questions were becoming increasingly urgent as physics itself was undergoing revolutionary changes. Chapter 4: Zurich and the Happiest Years. In 1921, opportunity finally came in the form of an invitation to join the University of Zurich as a full professor of theoretical physics. This appointment represented a dramatic improvement in Schrödinger's circumstances. He was replacing distinguished predecessors, taking over a chair that had been held by Albert Einstein and Max von Laue. For the first time in his career, he had genuine job security, adequate financial compensation, and the intellectual resources of a first-class university at his disposal. Schrödinger would later look back on his 6 years in Zurich as the happiest and most productive of his scientific life. The alpine setting seemed to agree with his temperament perfectly. He and Annemarie took a spacious apartment appropriate to their new status, and for the first time since their marriage, they could live comfortably without financial anxiety. The Swiss environment, with its combination of natural beauty and intellectual sophistication, provided the perfect backdrop for scientific creativity. At Zurich, Schrödinger found himself surrounded by exceptional colleagues who became not just professional associates but genuine friends. Hermann Weyl, one of the greatest mathematicians of the age, was there, bringing his profound insights into the mathematical foundations of physics. Peter Debye, a master of experimental and theoretical physics, provided another source of stimulation and collaboration. These were minds that could match Schrödinger's own depth and breadth, and their conversations ranged across the entire spectrum of physical science. The research atmosphere was extraordinarily stimulating. This was the height of the quantum revolution, and physicists were grappling with phenomena that seemed to defy common sense. Niels Bohr's atomic model had provided a framework for understanding atomic spectra, but it was clearly incomplete. Max Planck's quantum hypothesis had opened new vistas, but its implications remained unclear. Werner Heisenberg had just developed his matrix mechanics, but many physicists found its mathematical formalism abstract and difficult to visualize. Schrödinger threw himself into this intellectual ferment with characteristic enthusiasm. His papers during the Zurich period dealt with an impressive range of subjects. He worked on the specific heats of solids, diving deep into the statistical mechanical foundations of thermal physics. He explored problems in thermodynamics, showing his continued engagement with the probability theory that had been pioneered by his intellectual grandfather, Boltzmann. He investigated atomic spectra, seeking to understand how the structure of atoms determined the light they emitted and absorbed. But perhaps most remarkably, he also continued his work on color theory and physiological optics. This might seem like a digression from his main line of research, but it reflected Schrödinger's conviction that physics should ultimately be able to explain all natural phenomena, including the workings of biological systems. His studies of color perception were groundbreaking, introducing mathematical rigor into a field that had previously been largely qualitative. He developed what he called exact colorimetry and proposed theories of daylight color vision that would influence physiologists for years to come. Yet for all his productivity during these years, it was a footnote in a paper by Albert Einstein that would spark the work for which Schrödinger would be remembered. In 1925, Einstein published a paper that mentioned the work of Louis de Broglie, a young French physicist who had proposed that matter, like light, exhibited both wave and particle properties. De Broglie had suggested that electrons in atoms might be thought of as standing waves, rather than as particles orbiting the nucleus-like planets around the Sun. This idea captured Schrödinger's imagination in a way that few scientific concepts ever had. Here was a potential key to understanding the puzzling behavior of atomic systems, a way to make sense of the seemingly arbitrary rules that governed quantum phenomena. If electrons were waves, then their behavior might be describable by the same mathematical techniques that had proven so successful in acoustics and optics. The story of how Schrödinger developed his wave equation has become one of the great legends of physics. In December 1925, feeling the need for solitude and inspiration, he retreated to a mountain cabin in the Swiss Alps. He was accompanied not by his wife Anna Marie, but by a mysterious unnamed woman who has never been definitively identified by historians. There, in the pristine alpine environment, surrounded by snow-covered peaks and crystalline air, he began the most creative period of his scientific life. The mathematical challenges were formidable. Schrödinger initially tried to develop a relativistic wave equation, one that would be consistent with Einstein's special theory of relativity. He derived what we now know as the Klein-Gordon equation, but when he applied it to the hydrogen atom, the results disagreed with the spectroscopic data. Discouraged, he put aside his calculations and might have abandoned the project entirely. But during those weeks in the mountains, inspiration struck again. Perhaps, he thought, the relativistic corrections could be left for later. What if he focused first on developing a non-relativistic wave equation, one that would apply to situations where particles moved much slower than the speed of light? This approach proved brilliantly successful. The equation he derived, which would forever bear his name, accurately predicted the energy levels of the hydrogen atom and provided a clear physical picture of atomic structure. The Schrödinger equation represented a conceptual breakthrough of the first magnitude. Instead of thinking of electrons as point particles following definite orbits, it described them as wave patterns that filled all of space around the nucleus. These waves, which Schrödinger called wave functions, contained all the information about the electron's behavior. Their intensity at any point determined the probability of finding the electron at that location. Chapter 5. The Revolutionary Equation. The first months of 1926 marked one of the most extraordinary periods of creativity in the history of science. Working with feverish intensity, Schrödinger published 4 groundbreaking papers in the prestigious journal Annalen der Physik. These papers, which appeared in rapid succession, laid out the complete mathematical framework of what came to be known as wave mechanics. The first paper, published in January 1926, introduced the fundamental equation that would revolutionize physics. The time-independent Schrödinger equation, as it came to be known, provided a mathematical description of quantum systems that was both elegant and powerful. Unlike Heisenberg's matrix mechanics, which dealt with abstract mathematical objects that had no clear physical interpretation, Schrödinger's waves could be visualized and understood in terms of familiar concepts from classical physics. The mathematical beauty of the equation was breathtaking. In its simplest form, it stated that the energy of a system was equal to a particular mathematical operator acting on the wave function. This operator, called the Hamiltonian, incorporated both the kinetic energy of particles and their potential energy due to various forces. When solved, the equation yielded not just one solution but a whole family of solutions, each corresponding to a different energy state of the system. For the hydrogen atom, Schrödinger's equation produced results that were in perfect agreement with experimental observations. The energy levels that had been measured by spectroscopists for decades emerged naturally from the mathematics, without any of the arbitrary assumptions that had plagued earlier theories. Moreover, the wave functions themselves provided a vivid physical picture of atomic structure. Instead of thinking of the electron as a tiny particle whizzing around the nucleus, one could visualize it as a cloud of probability, with different shapes and patterns for different energy states. The second paper, which appeared just weeks after the first, demonstrated that this wave mechanical approach could be applied to more complex systems. Schrödinger showed how to handle atoms with multiple electrons, molecules with several nuclei, and even systems subject to external electric and magnetic fields. The mathematical framework was proving to be remarkably general and powerful. Perhaps even more significantly, the third paper established the equivalence between Schrödinger's wave mechanics and Heisenberg's matrix mechanics. Many physicists had initially viewed these as competing theories, unable to decide which approach was correct. Schrödinger's mathematical proof that they were simply different formulations of the same underlying theory was a triumph of theoretical physics. It showed that nature's fundamental laws could be expressed in multiple mathematical languages, each offering its own insights and advantages. The fourth paper explored the time-dependent version of the equation, showing how quantum systems evolved over time. This temporal aspect was crucial for understanding dynamic processes like chemical reactions, radioactive decay, and the emission of light by atoms. The time-dependent Schrödinger equation became one of the fundamental equations of physics, as important as Newton's laws of motion or Maxwell's equations for electromagnetism. The reception of Schrödinger's work was immediate and enthusiastic. Max Planck, the elder statesman of quantum theory, was among the first to recognize its significance. Einstein, whose footnote had sparked the entire development, was deeply impressed by the mathematical elegance and physical insight of the new theory. Even Niels Bohr, who had initially been skeptical of wave mechanical ideas, came to appreciate their power and beauty. But the implications of wave mechanics extended far beyond the narrow confines of atomic physics. If matter itself was wave-like, then many of the assumptions of classical physics would need to be reconsidered. The sharp distinction between particles and waves, which had seemed so fundamental, was beginning to blur. Reality at the microscopic level was revealing itself to be far stranger and more subtle than anyone had imagined. Schrödinger himself was somewhat ambivalent about these philosophical implications. He had developed wave mechanics partly because he hoped it would restore a kind of classical determinism to atomic physics. He wanted to replace the probabilistic interpretations of quantum theory with something more concrete and visualizable. The wave function, he initially hoped, might represent the actual physical structure of atomic systems, rather than merely a mathematical tool for calculating probabilities. This interpretation put him at odds with many of his Copenhagen colleagues, particularly Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg. They argued that the wave function was fundamentally a probability distribution, that quantum mechanics was inherently statistical, and that attempts to restore classical determinism were doomed to failure. This disagreement would lead to one of the most famous debates in the history of science, with profound implications for our understanding of reality itself. The success of wave mechanics brought Schrödinger international recognition and numerous honors. University positions that had previously been out of reach suddenly became available. In 1927, he received an offer that was impossible to refuse, an invitation to succeed Max Planck at the University of Berlin, one of the most prestigious physics appointments in the world. The move to Berlin represented the pinnacle of academic success, but it also marked the end of the happiest period of Schrödinger's life. He was reluctant to leave the alpine paradise of Zurich, where he had found both personal contentment and scientific inspiration. Annemarie shared his reservations about the move to the crowded, bustling German capital. But the prestige of the Berlin position and the opportunity to work alongside Einstein and other luminaries of German physics ultimately proved irresistible. Chapter 6: Berlin and the Quantum Debates. The Berlin that welcomed Erwin Schrödinger in 1927 was the undisputed center of world physics. The university's faculty included not only Einstein but also Max von Laue, Walter Nernst, and other giants of the field. The city's research institutes were conducting cutting-edge experiments. Its libraries contain the world's finest collections of scientific literature, and its lecture halls regularly hosted the most brilliant minds of the age. For Schrödinger, the appointment to succeed Max Planck was both an honor and a burden. Planck was not merely a distinguished physicist, but one of the founders of quantum theory itself. To follow in his footsteps required not just scientific competence, but a kind of intellectual courage that few possessed. Yet Schrödinger rose to the challenge with characteristic grace and determination. His lectures at Berlin were renowned for their clarity and insight. Unlike some theoretical physicists who became lost in mathematical abstractions, Schrödinger had the gift of making complex ideas accessible without sacrificing their essential depth. Students flocked to his courses not just to learn the latest developments in quantum mechanics, but to witness a master teacher at work. His approach was pedagogical in the best sense, not just imparting information but cultivating understanding. The research environment in Berlin was extraordinarily stimulating. Regular seminars brought together the leading physicists of Europe to debate the latest discoveries and their implications. It was in this context that some of the most famous debates in the history of science took place, particularly the ongoing discussions between Einstein and Bohr about the interpretation of quantum mechanics. Schrödinger found himself caught in the middle of this debate, his own views evolving as he grappled with the implications of his discoveries. He had created wave mechanics partly in the hope of restoring determinism to atomic physics, but the probabilistic interpretation championed by Bohr and his Copenhagen school was proving difficult to refute. The mathematics of quantum mechanics seemed to demand a fundamentally statistical view of nature, one that challenged traditional notions of causality and objectivity. It was during this period of intellectual ferment that Schrödinger conceived one of the most famous thought experiments in the history of science. In 1935, in correspondence with Einstein, he proposed the scenario of a cat locked in a box with a diabolical device linked to a quantum system. If a radioactive atom decayed, the device would trigger the release of poison, killing the cat. If the atom did not decay, the cat would remain alive. According to the quantum mechanical description, before anyone opened the box to observe the system, the atom would exist in a superposition of decayed and undecayed states. This would seem to imply that the cat too would exist in a superposition of alive and dead states, a conclusion that struck Schrödinger as absurd. He had not proposed this thought experiment to endorse such an interpretation, but rather to highlight what he saw as the logical difficulties of the Copenhagen approach. The cat paradox became one of the most discussed ideas in quantum mechanics, though often in ways that Schrödinger had not intended. Many popular accounts have presented it as if Schrödinger believed that cats could indeed exist in states that were simultaneously alive and dead. In reality, he was using the paradox to argue that something was wrong with the conventional interpretation of quantum mechanics, that the theory's success in predicting experimental results should not blind us to its conceptual problems. These were extraordinarily productive years for Schrödinger's research. In addition to his work on the foundations of quantum mechanics, he was exploring applications of his equation to a wide variety of physical systems. He investigated the behavior of electrons in metals, the properties of chemical bonds, and the quantum mechanical treatment of electromagnetic fields. His papers during this period displayed the same breadth and depth that had characterized his earlier work, but now informed by the mathematical power of wave mechanics. The collaboration with Einstein was particularly fruitful. Despite their significant age difference, the two men found that they shared similar concerns about the direction that quantum mechanics was taking. Both were troubled by the apparent randomness that seemed to be built into the theory's foundations. Both believed that a complete physical theory should provide a deterministic account of natural phenomena, not merely statistical predictions about experimental outcomes. Their correspondence during this period reveals two great minds grappling with the deepest questions about the nature of physical reality. Einstein's famous declaration that God does not play dice with the universe captured their shared conviction that the apparent randomness of quantum phenomena must conceal some deeper, deterministic structure. Schrödinger shared this hope, though he was perhaps more open than Einstein to the possibility that their intuitions might ultimately prove incorrect. The Berlin years were also personally fulfilling for Schrödinger. His marriage to Annemarie continued to thrive despite its unconventional nature, and he established close friendships with many of his colleagues. The cultural life of Berlin offered abundant opportunities for someone of his broad interests. He was a regular attendee at concerts and theatrical performances, maintaining the love of the arts that had been cultivated during his Viennese youth. But even as Schrödinger was reaching the peak of his professional success, dark clouds were gathering on the political horizon. The economic turmoil that had plagued Germany throughout the 1920s was creating social instability and political extremism. The Nazi Party, which had seemed like a marginal political movement during the early years of the decade, was beginning to gain significant popular support. Chapter 7: The darkening horizon. The year 1933 brought catastrophic changes to German intellectual life, changes that would forever alter the trajectory of Erwin Schrödinger's career. On January 30th, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, and within months, the Nazi Party had consolidated its grip on power. For the academic community, the implications were immediate and devastating. The new regime moved quickly to purge universities of professors deemed politically unreliable or racially unacceptable. Many of Schrödinger's closest colleagues and friends found themselves suddenly unemployed and facing an uncertain future. The intellectual community that had made Berlin the center of world physics was being systematically destroyed. The atmosphere in German universities became increasingly poisonous as Nazi ideology began to permeate academic life. Colleagues who had once engaged in free and open scientific debate now had to watch their words carefully. Students began to appear in university lecture halls wearing brown shirts and Nazi armbands. The very essence of scholarly inquiry, the willingness to follow evidence wherever it might lead, was being replaced by ideological conformity. For someone of Schrödinger's temperament and convictions, this environment was simply intolerable. He had spent his entire career in institutions that valued intellectual freedom above all else. The idea of having to tailor his teaching and research to suit political requirements was anathema to everything he believed about the scientific enterprise. The decision to leave Germany was not taken lightly. Berlin had provided Schrödinger with the most prestigious position in his field, excellent research facilities, and a comfortable lifestyle. But as 1933 progressed, it became clear that the situation was only going to get worse. More and more of his colleagues were being forced to flee, and those who remained found themselves under increasing pressure to demonstrate their loyalty to the new regime. In October 1933, Schrödinger submitted his resignation from the University of Berlin. Unlike many refugees who left Germany in desperation with little more than the clothes on their backs, he was fortunate to have options. His international reputation had opened doors for him in other countries, and he had received several offers of academic positions abroad. The most attractive of these came from Oxford University, where the Academic Assistance Council had been established to help refugee scholars find new positions. Oxford offered Schrödinger a fellowship that would allow him to continue his research in a congenial environment, surrounded by colleagues who shared his commitment to intellectual freedom. The timing of his departure proved fortuitous in an unexpected way. Just as Schrödinger was arriving in Oxford, he received news that he had been awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for 1933, shared with Paul Dirac. The recognition was deeply gratifying, though it must have been bittersweet given the circumstances under which he was receiving it. The Nobel Prize ceremony provided a platform for Schrödinger to reflect on the achievements and challenges of modern physics. In his acceptance speech, he paid tribute to his teachers and colleagues, particularly the late Fritz Haesnerhall, whose influence had been so crucial in his development. He also spoke about the collaborative nature of scientific progress, emphasizing how advances in physics resulted from the contributions of many minds working together across national and cultural boundaries. This message of international scientific cooperation was particularly poignant given the political circumstances of the time. As nationalism and militarism were tearing Europe apart, Schrödinger was reminding his audience that science transcended political boundaries, that the pursuit of knowledge was a fundamentally human endeavor that united rather than divided peoples. The move to Oxford represented a new chapter in Schrödinger's life, but it also marked the end of an era in European science. The great German physics departments that had dominated the field for generations were being decimated by political persecution. The intellectual community that had produced quantum mechanics, relativity theory, and so many other revolutionary advances was being scattered to the winds. For Schrödinger personally, the departure from Berlin was also the end of what had been the most scientifically productive period of his career. The wave equation that bore his name was now established as one of the fundamental equations of physics. His debate with Bohr and others over the interpretation of quantum mechanics had helped clarify the conceptual foundations of the theory. He had achieved everything that a theoretical physicist could hope for in terms of scientific recognition and professional success. Yet at the age of 46, he was essentially starting over, rebuilding his career in a new country with different traditions and expectations. The challenge was considerable, but Schrödinger approached it with the same intellectual courage and adaptability that had characterized his entire career. He was determined to continue his work despite the upheavals that had torn apart the world he had known. Chapter 8: Oxford Interlude and Unexpected Struggles. The Oxford that welcomed Erwin Schrödinger in the autumn of 1933 was an institution steeped in centuries of academic tradition, its ancient colleges and historic buildings bearing witness to generations of scholarly achievement. Yet for all its prestige and beauty, Oxford in the 1930s was a university still dominated by the humanities, where natural science occupied a somewhat secondary position in the institutional hierarchy. Schrödinger's arrival was heralded as a major coup for Oxford physics. Here was one of the founders of quantum mechanics, fresh from his triumph in Berlin, and newly crowned with a Nobel Prize. The university had high hopes that his presence would catalyze a renaissance in their physics department, raising its profile and attracting the kind of international attention that had long been focused on Cambridge. Yet from the beginning, the relationship between Schrödinger and Oxford was problematic. He spoke excellent English, thanks to his bilingual upbringing, and was thoroughly familiar with British culture from childhood visits to his maternal relatives in Leamington Spa. But the particular social and academic culture of Oxford, with its elaborate traditions and hierarchical structures, proved difficult for him to navigate. The university was dominated by figures from the humanities, scholars of classics and literature, who viewed the natural sciences with a mixture of respect and incomprehension. There were simply not enough high-caliber physicists at Oxford to provide Schrödinger with the kind of intellectual stimulation he had enjoyed in Berlin. The regular seminars and colloquia that had been such a feature of German academic life were largely absent, leaving him feeling intellectually isolated. Moreover, his position at Oxford was somewhat ambiguous. He was well paid but given no clearly defined duties or responsibilities. As his wife Anna Marie put it, he felt like a charity case, supported by the university's generosity, but without a clear role to play in its academic life. For someone accustomed to being at the center of intellectual activity, this marginalization was deeply frustrating. The contrast with his former life in Berlin was stark. There, he had been surrounded by brilliant colleagues, engaged in cutting-edge research, at the heart of the most important developments in modern physics. At Oxford, he found himself somewhat adrift, a distinguished visitor who was honored but not really integrated into the life of the institution. His research during the Oxford years continued to be productive, though perhaps less groundbreaking than his earlier work. He published 4 influential papers during his time there, including the famous work in which he coined the term entanglement to describe the mysterious correlations that could exist between quantum particles. This concept would later become central to our understanding of quantum mechanics, though its full significance would not be appreciated for decades. But even his scientific achievements seemed to be overshadowed by personal and professional frustrations. The British academic system, with its emphasis on formal procedures and traditional hierarchies, chafed against his more informal, continental approach to scholarly life. He was constantly receiving invitations to visit other universities and job offers from institutions around the world, and he perhaps unwisely took many of these too seriously, creating an impression of restlessness and dissatisfaction. The personal dimensions of his life also created difficulties in the conservative Oxford environment. His unconventional marriage arrangement, which had been tolerated if not accepted in the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Berlin, was viewed with suspicion by many of his new colleagues. The presence of Hilda March, his long-term mistress, and their daughter Ruth created social complications that were hard to navigate in the more traditional British academic setting. Even seemingly trivial matters became sources of irritation. He complained about the quality of British door knobs and bicycle brakes, small frustrations that perhaps reflected deeper dissatisfactions with his new environment. These complaints might seem petty, but they suggest someone who was struggling to find his place in a culture that remained fundamentally foreign to him, despite his linguistic fluency. As his 3-year fellowship progressed, it became increasingly clear that Oxford was not going to provide the intellectual home he was seeking. The university had hoped that his presence would transform their physics department, but the institutional changes necessary to support world-class research were slow in coming. The resources and infrastructure that existed in Germany were simply not available in Britain, at least not to the same degree. In 1936, In what seemed to many observers a bewildering decision, Schrödinger chose to return to Austria. He accepted a position at the University of Graz, supplemented by an honorary professorship at the University of Vienna. The financial terms were attractive, considerably better than what Oxford had offered, but the decision to leave Britain for Austria seemed to many to be politically naive in the extreme. Europe in 1936 was a continent on the brink of catastrophe. Hitler's Germany was rearming and making increasingly aggressive moves against its neighbors. The annexation of Austria, though still 2 years in the future, was already being discussed as a likely possibility. For a known opponent of Nazism to return to Austria at such a time seemed remarkably short-sighted. But Schrödinger's decision was perhaps motivated more by personal than political considerations. He missed the familiar environment of German-speaking academia, with its particular traditions and approaches to scholarship. He longed for the kind of intellectual community he had known in Vienna and Berlin, where physicists, mathematicians, and philosophers could engage in wide-ranging discussions about the deepest questions of science and philosophy. The return to Austria also represented a kind of homecoming for Anna Marie, who had her own family ties to the region. After years of exile and uncertainty, the prospect of settling down in familiar surroundings must have been appealing. Neither of them fully anticipated how quickly and completely their world would once again be turned upside down. The decision to leave Oxford would prove to be one of the most consequential of Schrödinger's career, though not in ways he could have foreseen. Within 2 years, he would find himself once again a refugee, forced to flee for his life as Hitler's armies marched into Austria. The brief interlude of apparent stability would prove to be merely the calm before an even more devastating storm. Chapter 9. The Anschluss and Desperate Flight. The morning of March 12, 1938, brought with it sounds that would forever change the course of Erwin Schrödinger's life. The rumble of German tanks and the tramp of marching boots echoed through the streets of Austrian cities as Hitler's Wehrmacht crossed the border, implementing the long-threatened Anschluss that would absorb Austria into the German Reich. For Schrödinger, working quietly at the University of Graz, the invasion came with shocking suddenness, leaving him with virtually no time to prepare for what would follow. The Nazi authorities had long memories, and Schrödinger's name was prominently listed among those who had publicly opposed the regime during his Berlin years. His departure from Germany in 1933 had been noted, his criticisms of Nazi ideology remembered. Within days of the Anschluss, he was summarily dismissed from his position at the University of Vienna. The comfortable academic life he had tried to rebuild in his homeland was shattered in an instant. The speed with which events unfolded left Schrödinger reeling. Unlike his departure from Germany, which had been planned and orderly, this was a desperate flight for survival. He had only hours to decide whether to attempt an escape or to remain and face whatever persecution the new regime might inflict. The choice was made easier by his knowledge of what had happened to other anti-Nazi intellectuals who had fallen into the hands of the Gestapo. In what must have been an agonizing decision, Schrödinger attempted to buy time by writing a letter to his local newspaper in Graz, expressing support for the Nazi annexation. This public recantation of his earlier anti-Nazi stance was deeply humiliating for a man of his principles and convictions. He would later admit to Einstein that the letter was cowardly, but it was perhaps necessary to give him the breathing room needed to plan an escape. The plan that emerged was both desperate and ingenious. Leaving behind virtually all their possessions, Schrödinger and Annemarie prepared for a harrowing journey to freedom. He placed his most important documents in a small suitcase, leaving behind his Nobel Prize medal in the back of a filing cabinet in his Graz office, and loaded everything into his aging automobile. The drive to the Italian frontier was a journey fraught with tension and danger. At any moment, they might encounter a roadblock or be stopped by suspicious officials. The borders were being watched, and known anti-Nazi figures were being prevented from leaving the country. Every mile brought them closer to safety, but also deeper into territory controlled by Hitler's forces. At the Italian border, faced with the impossibility of driving across in their conspicuous Austrian car, Schrödinger made a final desperate gamble. He abandoned the vehicle by the side of a country road, and taking only their essential documents, he and Annemarie crossed the frontier on foot. It was an undignified end to his Austrian period. Two distinguished academics reduced to walking across international borders like common refugees. Once safely on Italian soil, the immediate danger was past, but the future remained deeply uncertain. Schrödinger had contacts in Rome, and from there he was able to telephone Dublin, trying to reach Eamon de Valera, the Irish Prime Minister who had previously extended an invitation to come to Ireland. The irony was not lost on him that he was seeking refuge in a country he had never visited, relying on the kindness of strangers in a land he knew only by reputation. The journey from Austria to Rome, and then the anxious wait while trying to establish contact with Dublin, must have been emotionally devastating for both Schrödinger and Annemarie. They had now been forced to flee their homeland twice in 5 years. All the material security they had built up was gone. At the age of 51, Schrödinger was once again starting over, dependent on the charity of foreign institutions for his very survival. The psychological impact of this second exile cannot be overstated. The first departure from Germany had been difficult but planned. He had left with his reputation intact, his Nobel Prize in hand, and multiple offers of employment waiting. This flight from Austria was different entirely. It was a desperate escape from immediate physical danger, a recognition that the world he had known was disappearing forever. Yet even in these desperate circumstances, Schrödinger's resilience shone through. Once he had established contact with Dublin and received confirmation that the offer of a position at the proposed Institute for Advanced Studies was still open, he began planning for yet another new beginning. His ability to adapt to changing circumstances, to find ways to continue his work despite external upheavals, was truly remarkable. The train journey from Rome to Paris, and then the boat trip across the English Channel to Britain, marked the beginning of another chapter in his peripatetic career. He returned to Oxford exactly one day before his original 5-year fellowship would have expired, an ironic bookend to his troubled relationship with that institution. But Oxford could offer him only temporary refuge. His future lay elsewhere, in a country he had never seen, working with people he had never met. Chapter 10. Dublin and the Institute for Advanced Studies. When Erwin Schrödinger stepped off the boat at Dublin port in 1940, he was entering not just a new country, but a new phase of his life that would prove to be among the most significant and fulfilling of his career. Ireland in 1940 was a young nation, having achieved independence from Britain less than 2 decades earlier, but it was led by a man of remarkable vision and intellectual ambition. Eamon de Valera, the Irish Prime Minister, was himself a mathematician who understood the importance of scientific research for a nation's development. His dream was to establish an institute that would put Ireland on the international map of scholarship, a center of excellence that could compete with the great research institutions of Europe and America. The model he had in mind was the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study, where Einstein and other luminaries had found refuge from the upheavals of European politics. The timing of Schrödinger's arrival was fortuitous for both parties. De Valera needed an internationally recognized scientist to give credibility to his new institute, and Schrödinger needed a safe haven where he could continue his work without fear of political persecution. The match between the Nobel Prize-winning physicist and the ambitious Irish politician would prove to be one of the most successful partnerships in the history of modern science. The Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies was formally established in 1940, with Schrödinger as the founding director of the School of Theoretical Physics. The institute took up residence at 65 Merrion Square, one of Dublin's most elegant Georgian addresses. For the first time since leaving Berlin, Schrödinger found himself in charge of building a research program from the ground up, with the resources and autonomy to pursue his scientific interests without external interference. The challenge was considerable. Ireland had virtually no tradition of advanced physics research, and there were few local scientists with the background necessary to participate in cutting-edge theoretical work. Schrödinger would have to create not just a research program, but an entire scientific culture, introducing Irish students and faculty to concepts and techniques that were barely known outside the major European centers. He approached this challenge with characteristic energy and enthusiasm. His first courses at the Institute were on quantum theory, presenting material that had never before been taught at this level in Ireland. The lectures attracted audiences of several hundred, drawing not just physicists but mathematicians, philosophers, and intellectuals from across Dublin's academic community. The intellectual atmosphere that Schrödinger created at the Institute was extraordinary. He was joined by Walter Heitler, another refugee from Nazi persecution, who brought expertise in quantum chemistry and the theory of chemical bonding. Together, they established a research program that was genuinely international in scope, attracting visitors and collaborators from around the world despite Ireland's geographical isolation and political neutrality. The war years, which might have been a period of intellectual isolation, instead became a time of remarkable creativity for Schrödinger. Cut off from the usual channels of scientific communication, he was forced to rely more heavily on his own intellectual resources. This enforced solitude led him to explore new areas of research and to think more deeply about fundamental questions that had been nagging at him for years. It was during this period that Schrödinger began to seriously engage with biology, a field that had always interested him, but which he had never systematically explored. The isolation of wartime Ireland gave him the time and mental space to read widely in biological literature, and to think about how the concepts and methods of physics might be applied to living systems. In February 1943, he delivered a series of public lectures at Trinity College, Dublin, that would prove to be among the most influential scientific presentations of the 20th century. The lectures, later published as the book, What is Life?, represented Schrödinger's attempt to apply the insights of quantum mechanics and statistical mechanics to the fundamental processes of life. The central question he posed was deceptively simple. How can the events that take place within a living organism be accounted for by the laws of physics and chemistry? But his answer was revolutionary. He proposed that heredity must be based on what he called an aperiodic crystal, a complex molecule that could store information in its structure and pass that information on to subsequent generations. The lectures attracted an audience of about 400, including de Valera himself and members of his cabinet. The warning that the subject matter was difficult and that the lectures could not be termed popular did nothing to diminish the enthusiasm of the audience. They were witnessing something extraordinary, a physicist of the first rank applying the full power of modern theoretical methods to the ancient mystery of life itself. The impact of What is Life? Was immediate and profound. Among those inspired by Schrödinger's lectures was a young American scientist named James Watson, who would later write that the book was crucial in directing his attention to the problem of genetic inheritance. Francis Crick, Watson's future collaborator in the discovery of DNA structure, was similarly influenced by Schrödinger's ideas. The book proposed the existence of a molecular code as the basis of genetic inheritance, anticipating by nearly a decade the actual discovery of the DNA double helix. Schrödinger's vision of heredity as an information storage and transmission system was remarkably prescient, pointing the way toward the molecular revolution in biology that would transform our understanding of life. But Schrödinger's interests during the Dublin years extended far beyond biology. He continued his work on the foundations of quantum mechanics, publishing important papers on the interpretation of wave functions and the measurement problem. He also explored applications of general relativity, investigated statistical mechanics, and maintained his long-standing interest in color theory and physiological optics. Chapter 11. The Philosopher-Scientist. The years in Dublin proved to be a period of remarkable intellectual flowering for Schrödinger, but not in the ways one might have expected from a theoretical physicist at the height of his powers. While he continued to work on technical problems in quantum mechanics and relativity theory, his most significant contributions during this period lay in exploring the broader implications of modern science for our understanding of reality, consciousness, and the meaning of existence itself. The isolation of wartime Ireland, which might have been a professional disadvantage for a scientist dependent on international collaboration, instead became a source of creative freedom. Cut off from the usual pressures of academic life and the constant stream of new publications that demanded attention, Schrödinger found himself with the time and mental space to engage with fundamental questions that had been troubling him for decades. His philosophical interests, which had been developing since his student days in Vienna, now began to mature into a systematic exploration of the relationship between mind and matter, between the subjective experience of consciousness and the objective descriptions of science. The quantum revolution had raised profound questions about the role of the observer in physical measurement, questions that seem to blur the traditional boundary between subjective and objective reality. In his 1944 book, Mind and Matter, Schrödinger grappled with these issues in a way that was both scientifically informed and philosophically sophisticated. He drew heavily on his readings in Eastern philosophy, particularly the Vedantic tradition of Hindu thought, which had long fascinated him with its insights into the nature of consciousness and reality. The idea that individual consciousness might be understood as part of a universal consciousness resonated deeply with his understanding of quantum mechanics and its implications. These philosophical investigations were not mere academic exercises for Schrödinger. They grew out of his deep engagement with the conceptual foundations of quantum mechanics and his persistent unease with the standard Copenhagen interpretation. If quantum mechanics was correct in its assertion that the act of measurement played a fundamental role in determining physical reality, then consciousness itself might be a necessary component of any complete description of the natural world. His exploration of these themes was characterized by the same intellectual rigor and mathematical sophistication that had marked his purely scientific work. He was not content with vague philosophical speculations, but sought to ground his insights in the concrete achievements of modern physics. The result was a body of work that bridged the gap between science and philosophy in ways that few of his contemporaries were capable of achieving. The Dublin years also saw Schrödinger writing extensively about the social and cultural implications of scientific progress. Living in a neutral country during World War II, he had a unique perspective on the ways that scientific knowledge could be used for both constructive and destructive purposes. The development of nuclear weapons, based partly on theoretical insights he had helped to develop, forced him to confront the moral responsibilities of scientists in an age of unprecedented technological power. His writings during this period reveal a deep concern about the relationship between scientific knowledge and human values. He argued that science alone could not provide guidance for human action, that the objective descriptions of physical reality needed to be supplemented by insights from ethics, aesthetics, and philosophy. This was not a rejection of scientific rationality, but rather a recognition of its limitations and the need for a more integrated approach to understanding human existence. The intellectual freedom he enjoyed in Dublin also allowed Schrödinger to pursue his long-standing interest in the history and philosophy of science. He wrote extensively about the development of quantum mechanics, offering insiders' perspectives on the debates and discoveries that had shaped the field. His historical writings were marked by both scholarly accuracy and personal insight, providing future generations with invaluable accounts of one of the most revolutionary periods in the history of science. One of the most remarkable aspects of Schrödinger's Dublin period was his ability to communicate complex scientific ideas to general audiences without sacrificing their essential depth and sophistication. What is Life became a classic of popular science writing, inspiring countless readers to pursue careers in biology and physics. His lectures at Trinity College, Dublin, were attended not just by scientists, but by intellectuals from across Irish society, demonstrating his gift for making abstract concepts accessible to educated laypeople. This ability to bridge the gap between specialized scientific knowledge and broader cultural understanding was perhaps Schrödinger's greatest contribution during his Irish years. At a time when science was becoming increasingly technical and specialized, he showed that it was still possible to engage with fundamental questions in ways that could speak to the deepest human concerns about the nature of reality and our place within it. The personal dimensions of his life during this period were equally complex and fascinating. His unconventional family arrangement with Anna Marie, Hilda March, and their daughter Ruth all living under the same roof created a domestic situation that was unusual by any standards. Yet by all accounts, it was a harmonious household where intellectual work could flourish alongside personal relationships that defied conventional categories. During his time in Dublin, Schrödinger also fathered 2 more daughters by 2 different women, adding further complexity to an already unconventional personal life. Yet these relationships, however irregular they might have seemed to outside observers, appear to have provided him with the emotional stability and intellectual stimulation he needed to pursue his work at the highest level. Chapter 12. The Final Return. As the 1950s dawned, Erwin Schrödinger found himself approaching the age of retirement while still intellectually vibrant and scientifically productive. The Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies had been a remarkable success, establishing Ireland as a legitimate player in international theoretical physics and inspiring a generation of Irish scientists to pursue careers in research. Yet as he entered his 70s, thoughts of home began to weigh more heavily on his mind. The Austria that had expelled him in 1938 was slowly emerging from the devastation of World War II. The Nazi regime that had forced him into exile was gone, replaced by a democratic government eager to rebuild the country's intellectual and cultural institutions. For a man who had spent nearly 2 decades in various forms of exile, the prospect of returning home held enormous appeal. In 1956, the University of Vienna made him an offer that was both practically attractive and emotionally irresistible. They created a special chair in theoretical physics just for him, recognizing both his international stature and his desire to end his career where it had begun. At the age of 69, Schrödinger decided to accept this invitation and return to the city of his birth. The homecoming was bittersweet. The Vienna of his youth, the glittering intellectual capital of the Habsburg Empire, was gone forever. The city he returned to was smaller, more provincial, still bearing the scars of war and occupation. Many of the colleagues and friends of his early career were dead or scattered. The Physics Institute, where he had begun his career as Exner's assistant, was physically and intellectually diminished from its former glory. Yet there was something deeply satisfying about this return to origins. Schrödinger took up residence in a comfortable apartment and began the process of re-establishing himself in Viennese academic life. His lectures at the university drew large audiences, eager to hear from the Nobel laureate who had helped create the quantum revolution. Students who had only read about wave mechanics in textbooks now had the opportunity to learn about it from its creator. The scientific work of his final years was less revolutionary than his earlier contributions, but no less significant for his personal development. He continued to explore the foundations of quantum mechanics, never entirely satisfied with the Copenhagen interpretation, but unable to formulate a completely satisfactory alternative. His papers during this period were characterized by deep philosophical reflection on the meaning and implications of the theories he had helped to create. He also returned to his early interest in general relativity, exploring unified field theories that attempted to bring together gravitation and electromagnetism in a single theoretical framework. This work, while not ultimately successful, demonstrated his continued willingness to tackle the most fundamental problems in theoretical physics even as he approached the end of his career. Perhaps most poignantly, he began work on what would become his final book, an autobiographical reflection on his life and scientific career. These sketches, written in the twilight of his life, provide invaluable insights into the mind of one of the 20th century's greatest scientists. They reveal a man who remained intellectually curious and emotionally engaged with the world, even as his physical strength began to decline. The tuberculosis that had plagued him intermittently throughout his adult life began to reassert itself during his final years in Vienna. The high-altitude cures that had worked in his youth were no longer effective, and it became clear that his condition was deteriorating. In May 1960, he underwent thorough medical examinations that confirmed the diagnosis of tuberculosis due to age. Despite his declining health, Schrödinger remained intellectually active almost until the end. He continued to correspond with colleagues around the world, maintained his interest in philosophical questions, and worked on scientific papers whenever his strength permitted. His mind remained as sharp as ever, even as his body grew increasingly frail. In the summer of 1960, he retired to Alpbach, the mountain village that had been a favorite retreat since his childhood. The clean alpine air and peaceful surroundings had always been sources of restoration for him, and he hoped that one final stay in the mountains might restore his strength. But it was not to be. The tuberculosis had progressed too far, and his body no longer had the resources to fight back. On January 4, 1961, at 7 in the evening, Erwin Schrödinger died peacefully in his beloved Alpbach, with his faithful wife Anna-Marie at his side. He was 73 years old, having lived through some of the most turbulent and transformative periods in human history. His death marked the end of an era in physics, the passing of one of the last great figures who had witnessed and helped create the quantum revolution. Chapter 13. The Enduring Legacy. The funeral of Erwin Schrödinger on January 9, 1961, drew mourners from across Europe and beyond, a testament to the profound impact he had made on the scientific world. Hans Thüring, his old friend and colleague, delivered the funeral address in the small cemetery at Alpbach, speaking not just of Schrödinger's scientific achievements, but of his humanity, his courage, and his unwavering commitment to the pursuit of truth. The legacy that Schrödinger left behind was extraordinary in both its scope and its depth. The wave equation that bears his name has become one of the fundamental equations of physics, as important as Newton's laws of motion or Maxwell's equations for electromagnetism. Every student of quantum mechanics learned to solve the Schrödinger equation. Every researcher in atomic and molecular physics used it daily in their work. It has become the mathematical language for describing the behavior of matter at the microscopic level. But Schrödinger's influence extended far beyond the narrow confines of theoretical physics. His book, What is Life?, has inspired an entire generation of biologists to think about living systems in terms of information storage and processing. The discovery of the DNA double helix by Watson and Crick was directly influenced by Schrödinger's vision of an aperiodic crystal that could encode genetic information. The molecular revolution in biology that transformed our understanding of life itself can be traced back to the lectures he delivered in wartime Dublin. The philosophical implications of his work continued to resonate throughout the latter half of the 20th century and beyond. The cat paradox he had proposed as a critique of quantum mechanics became one of the most discussed thought experiments in the history of science. While Schrödinger himself had intended it to highlight the absurdities of certain interpretations of quantum theory, it ended up illuminating fundamental questions about the nature of reality, observation, and the relationship between quantum and classical physics. Modern developments in quantum mechanics have vindicated many of Schrödinger's insights while also revealing new depths to his contributions. The concept of quantum entanglement, which he first named and explored, has become central to our understanding of quantum mechanics and has led to revolutionary applications in quantum computing and quantum cryptography. Technologies that would have seemed like science fiction in Schrödinger's time are now becoming reality, based on principles he helped to establish. His approach to science, which emphasized mathematical beauty, physical insight, and philosophical depth, became a model for subsequent generations of theoretical physicists. The ability to work across disciplines, to see connections between apparently disparate fields, to ask fundamental questions about the nature of reality. These qualities that characterized Schrödinger's career became hallmarks of the best scientific work. The institutions he helped to establish also continued to flourish long after his death. The Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies remains one of Ireland's premier research institutions, continuing to attract internationally recognized scientists and to contribute to cutting-edge research in theoretical physics. The precedent he set for refugee scientists, showing how scientific talent could flourish even in exile, provided hope and inspiration for later generations of scholars forced to flee political persecution. Perhaps most importantly, Schrödinger's example demonstrated the possibility of maintaining intellectual integrity and moral courage in the face of political pressure and personal hardship. His refusal to compromise his principles when confronted with Nazi ideology, his willingness to abandon prestigious positions rather than work under oppressive regimes, his commitment to international scientific cooperation even during periods of nationalism and war. All of these choices established him as a model of scientific citizenship. The questions he raised about the interpretation of quantum mechanics continue to challenge physicists and philosophers today. The measurement problem, the role of consciousness in physical theory, the relationship between mathematical formalism and physical reality. These issues that troubled Schrödinger throughout his career remain at the center of contemporary debates about the foundations of quantum mechanics. His interdisciplinary approach, bringing together physics, biology, philosophy, and even Eastern mysticism in his search for understanding, anticipated the increasing integration of scientific disciplines that characterizes modern research. The boundaries between physics and biology, between science and philosophy, between Western and Eastern thought, all of these artificial divisions that Schrödinger challenges have continued to blur in the decades since his death. As we reach the end of our journey through the remarkable life of Erwin Schrödinger, we find ourselves contemplating not just the achievements of one extraordinary individual, but the very nature of scientific discovery and human understanding itself. Here was a man who began his career in the gaslit world of Imperial Vienna and ended it in the atomic age, having helped to create the conceptual frameworks that made that transformation possible. The story we have traced is one of intellectual courage and creative vision, of the willingness to follow ideas wherever they might lead, regardless of the personal or professional consequences. Schrödinger's life reminds us that great science is not just about technical mastery or mathematical sophistication, though these are certainly important. It is about the courage to ask fundamental questions, to challenge accepted wisdom, to see familiar phenomena from radically new perspectives. His equation, elegant in its mathematical simplicity yet profound in its physical implications, opened up entirely new ways of understanding the behavior of matter and energy. The wave function that it describes became the key to unlocking the secrets of atoms and molecules, leading to applications that have revolutionized technology and transformed our daily lives. From the computers we use to the medical imaging that saves lives, from the lasers that carry our communications to the solar cells that harvest energy from the sun, the quantum mechanical principles that Schrödinger helped to establish underlie much of modern technology. But perhaps even more significant than his technical contributions was his demonstration that science at its best is a deeply human endeavor, one that engages not just our analytical capabilities, but our aesthetic sensibilities, our philosophical inclinations, and our ethical commitments. His life showed that it is possible to be simultaneously a rigorous scientist and a thoughtful humanist, to pursue objective truth while remaining deeply engaged with questions of meaning and value. The challenges he faced in his personal and professional life, the need to rebuild his career multiple times in different countries, the courage required to maintain his principles in the face of political persecution, all of these experiences shaped not just his individual destiny but his scientific vision. His understanding of quantum mechanics was deepened by his philosophical investigations. His biological insights were informed by his physical training, and his approach to teaching was enriched by his broad cultural interests. The world that Schrödinger inhabited, the intellectual community that nurtured his genius, was destroyed by the political upheavals of the 20th century. The great German physics departments, the international networks of scholarly collaboration, the assumption that science transcended national boundaries, all of these were shattered by war and ideology. Yet science itself survived and flourished, partly because individuals like Schrödinger carried its values and methods to new environments, adapting and innovating while preserving the essential spirit of scientific inquiry. His legacy reminds us that science is not just about accumulating facts or developing technologies, important as these may be. It is about the fundamental human drive to understand our place in the universe, to make sense of the bewildering complexity of natural phenomena, to find order and beauty in the apparent chaos of experience. The questions that motivated Schrödinger about the nature of reality, the role of consciousness, the relationship between mind and matter, remain as compelling today as they were during his lifetime. As we face our own scientific and technological challenges, as we grapple with questions about artificial intelligence, climate change, genetic engineering, and quantum computing, Schrödinger's example provides both inspiration and guidance. His willingness to cross disciplinary boundaries, his insistence on asking fundamental questions, his commitment to rigorous thinking combined with imaginative speculation, all of these approaches remain relevant to contemporary scientific work. The peaceful village of Alpbach, where Schrödinger spent his final days and where his body rests, has become a pilgrimage site for physicists and philosophers from around the world. They come not just to pay respects to one of the founders of quantum mechanics, but to reflect on the profound questions about the nature of reality that his work continues to raise. In the quiet beauty of that alpine setting, surrounded by the mountains he loved, visitors often find themselves contemplating the same mysteries that occupied Schrödinger's brilliant mind. The wave equation that bears his name will continue to be written on blackboards and computer screens around the world, solved by students and researchers seeking to understand everything from the behavior of electrons in semiconductors to the quantum properties of exotic materials. Each time it is used, each new application or interpretation extends the reach of insights that first emerged in those creative weeks in the Swiss mountains nearly a century ago. But perhaps Schrödinger's most enduring contribution is the reminder that science, at its deepest level, is an adventure of the human spirit. It is about the courage to question, the willingness to be surprised, the humility to acknowledge the limits of our understanding while never ceasing to push against those boundaries. In an age of increasing specialization and technical complexity, his example reminds us that the most profound advances often come from those who can see the forest as well as the trees, who can appreciate both the mathematical elegance of physical laws and their profound implications for our understanding of ourselves and our place in the cosmos. As you drift toward sleep, consider this. Somewhere in the quantum realm that Schrödinger helped to reveal, particles dance between states of possibility, waves of probability ripple through space and time, and the very foundations of reality shimmer with uncertainty and potential. In that strange and beautiful world that exists beyond the reach of our ordinary senses, the legacy of Erwin Schrödinger lives on, continuing to inspire new generations of scientists and thinkers to explore the deepest mysteries of existence. The gentle rhythm of quantum mechanics, the eternal dance of wave and particle, the silent symphony of mathematical equations describing the behavior of the universe at its most fundamental level. These form a kind of cosmic lullaby that connects us all to the profound insights that emerged from one brilliant mind's encounter with the infinite complexity and beauty of nature itself. And in that connection, in that shared participation in the grand adventure of understanding, we find perhaps the most fitting tribute to the life and work of Erwin Schrödinger. The recognition that science, at its best, is not just about knowing, but about wondering, not just about answers, but about the courage to keep asking ever deeper questions about the mysterious and magnificent universe we inhabit. If this journey through Schrödinger's remarkable life has sparked your curiosity or provided you with moments of insight, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to our channel. If you found particular moments in Schrödinger's story that resonated with you, whether it was his early struggles with financial insecurity, his creative breakthrough in the Swiss mountains, his courage in the face of political persecution, or his philosophical reflections on the nature of reality, please share your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of his life do you find most inspiring or thought-provoking? Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the wonder and possibility that drove Erwin Schrödinger to reveal some of the deepest secrets of nature itself.